In the sweltering summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army stood as one of the most formidable and battle-hardened military forces on the planet. This wasn't just an army, it was a steel behemoth comprised of 330,000 elite soldiers, armed with thousands of powerful artillery pieces and supported by legions of tanks, a truly magnificent and terrifying war machine. Yet, a mere 4 months later, this entire army had effectively ceased to exist. It wasn't simply defeated in a conventional battle, it was utterly and systematically annihilated, as if it had been swallowed by the frozen earth and erased from history. The catalyst for this unprecedented catastrophe was not a stroke of bad luck, nor a brilliant surprise from the enemy. It happened because one single individual, Adolf Hitler, in the grip of his own titanic ego, refused to listen to the advice of his most experienced generals and admit he had made a mistake. Welcome back. Today we delve into the pivotal months that marked the turning point of the Second World War in Europe. We will bridge the gap between Germany's stunning victory in France in 1940 and the utter, soul-crushing disaster in the frozen plains of Russia just 2 years later. We will examine how an army that appeared invincible, an army that had blitzed through France in a mere 6 weeks, could find itself broken, starved, and ultimately surrendering in the rubble-choked basements of a Russian city. A city that, incredibly, was never meant to be the primary objective of the entire summer campaign. By the end of this video, you will have a clear understanding of how Germany's grand strategy disintegrated, and which single fatal decision, made personally by Hitler himself, sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. Long before the name Stalingrad became a synonym for military disaster, the German High Command had a plan named Operation Blue. This was a grand, ambitious offensive designed to drive deep into southern Russia and seize the vast, rich oil fields of the Caucasus. The German war machine, from its tanks to its aircraft, was guzzling fuel at an unsustainable rate, and securing this black gold was considered absolutely essential for Germany to continue the war. On June 28, 1942, to execute this plan, Army Group South was split into two powerful formations. Army Group A was directed to push southward, straight for the oil. Army Group B, which prominently featured the Sixth Army, was assigned the critical but secondary task of protecting the northern flank of this main advance, establishing a defensive line along the Don and Volga rivers. One of these objectives would provide the very fuel needed to achieve victory. The other objective was largely a matter of prestige, the capture of a city desired primarily because of the name it carried. Can you guess which one ultimately captured Hitler's obsessive, unwavering attention? The city of Stalingrad was, in the initial planning of Operation Blue, a secondary concern. The original strategy called for its swift capture to neutralize it as an industrial center and railway hub, thereby securing the flank, before the main effort continued south. But everything changed the moment the city's name began to dominate conversations in Hitler's military briefings. The city bore the name of his arch-nemesis, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and for Hitler, this transformed the military objective into a deeply personal vendetta. He confessed to one of his generals, "The capture of Stalingrad is of immense importance, mainly because the city itself is named after Stalin." With that single, ego-driven declaration, the entire strategic focus of the German war effort on the Eastern Front pivoted. The campaign was no longer a logical military operation to secure vital resources. It had morphed into a symbolic battle of wills, a staring contest with history itself, to be won at any cost, no matter how many lives it consumed. Once the German assault pushed into the sprawling urban landscape of Stalingrad, traditional warfare ceased to exist. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, subjected the city to a relentless 2-day bombing campaign that left it a smoldering, flattened ruin. But a city of shattered buildings and skeletal factories offers the perfect terrain for a determined defender. Every bombed-out apartment block became a fortress, every basement a fortified bunker, and every pile of rubble a deadly ambush point. The vaunted German doctrine of blitzkrieg, which relied on the speed of tanks and the coordination of combined arms, was rendered completely and utterly useless in this new environment. A panzer commander couldn't see past the next destroyed building. A Soviet captain named Anton Dragan later grimly remarked, "If the Germans captured a building in the morning, we would inevitably take it back by the evening. We began measuring our progress not in kilometers, but in bricks. Tanks were channeled into narrow, debris-choked streets where they were easily destroyed. Radio signals couldn't penetrate the thick stone walls of cellars where commanders hid. Every bomb crater meant to destroy the enemy became a potential grave for the attacker. The German soldiers, in their black humor and despair, gave this new hell a name: Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, because they felt that only rats could hope to survive and navigate such horrific subterranean conditions. While the elite German Sixth Army was being bled white in the meat grinder of Stalingrad's ruins, its long exposed flanks were held by armies from Germany's allies, Romania, Hungary, and Italy. These Allied soldiers were neither as well equipped nor as well trained as their German counterparts, and their morale was dangerously low. They were keenly aware that they had been handed an almost impossible task with inadequate resources. Throughout the autumn, German intelligence officers on the front lines began sending increasingly urgent warnings back to headquarters. They reported a massive, clandestine buildup of fresh Soviet troops and armor on the far side of the river, opposite the weak Allied positions. These alarming reports were systematically dismissed and ignored by the German High Command, who believed the Soviets had exhausted their reserves. On October 30th, General Franz Halder, a senior officer, chillingly noted in his diary, "We have no clear idea what reserves the enemy still possesses." Just a few weeks later, the Soviets would reveal to them, in the most brutal fashion imaginable, exactly what those reserves could do. On the freezing morning of November 19, 1942, the very ground began to tremble under the weight of an unprecedented artillery barrage. The Soviets had unleashed their massive surprise counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. A colossal force of 1 million Soviet soldiers, supported by 1,000 T-34 tanks, erupted from the mists and smashed directly into the fragile Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies guarding the Sixth Army's flanks. The thinly stretched and poorly equipped Romanian armies disintegrated within hours, their lines shattering under the sheer force of the blow. Just 4 days later, on November 23rd, the two mighty pincers of the Soviet attack converged at the town of Kalach, far to the west of Stalingrad. The trap had slammed shut. The German Sixth Army, now numbering around 270,000 men, was completely encircled and cut off from the outside world. They were trapped deep in hostile territory, inside a vast pocket of enemies that the Germans would come to call der Kessel, the cauldron. With the Sixth Army now hopelessly trapped, the only conceivable lifeline for supplies, ammunition, and potential evacuation was by air. Hitler ordered one of his most capable commanders, Field Marshal von Manstein, to assemble a relief force and attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement from the south. Simultaneously, the chief of the German Air Force, the notoriously boastful Hermann Göring, made a catastrophic and wildly irresponsible promise. He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could single-handedly supply the entire trapped army from the air. The army's own quartermasters calculated that a bare minimum of 350 plane loads of supplies were needed every single day to keep the army from starving. On its most successful day, the airlift managed only 289 flights. On many days, plagued by mechanical failures and blinding blizzards, fewer than 30 planes reached the pocket. The courageous pilots had to fly a gauntlet through dense anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Soviet fighters in horrific winter conditions. They attempted to land on cratered, makeshift runways that were often illuminated only by the ghostly flames of other crashed and burning transport planes. By Christmas, less than a month into the effort, half of the Luftwaffe's transport fleet on the southern front had been shot down or had crashed. The soldiers trapped inside the cauldron, promised salvation from the skies, were receiving a starvation ration of just 4 ounces of bread per person each day. Inside the freezing cauldron, the commander of the Sixth Army, General Friedrich Paulus, was confronted with an impossible, soul-destroying choice. He could maintain his oath of loyalty to Hitler and preside over the slow, agonizing death of every man under his command, or he could defy his Führer, surrender, and save the lives of those who remained. On January 8th, the Soviets extended a formal offer of surrender to Paulus, promising humane treatment for his men. Paulus, a man of duty, dutifully sent a radio message to Hitler's headquarters, outlining the hopeless situation and requesting permission to negotiate terms. Hitler's reply was swift, unequivocal, and devoid of any compassion. Surrender is impossible. The Sixth Army will perform its historic duty at Stalingrad and fight to the very last man. As a final, cruel twist, a week later, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. This was no honor. It was a sinister and thinly veiled command, a death sentence delivered by promotion, as no German field marshal in the nation's long military history had ever surrendered. Paulus understood the message perfectly. He retreated to the cold, damp basement of the Univermag department store and, in a state of paralysis, simply waited for the inevitable end. Between January 10th and the beginning of February, the pocket held by the Germans shrank relentlessly from a large territory of ruined suburbs to just a few devastated city blocks. The men trapped inside were beyond starving. They were specters. They survived by boiling strips of horsehide scavenged from frozen carcasses to create a thin, greasy soup. They burned furniture, floorboards, and the wooden stocks of their own rifles simply to stay warm. Some even resorted to eating the leather from their belts and boots. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius, and the biting wind was a constant torment. More men died from frostbite and disease than from enemy bullets. When the final Soviet assaults came, many German soldiers were physically too weak to even lift their rifles, let alone fight. They propped their emaciated bodies against ruined walls, resting their weapons on the frozen, snow-dusted corpses of their fallen friends for one last defiant shot. In the end, a skeletal mass of 91,000 men surrendered and were marched away into the brutal Soviet prison camp system. Of those 91,000 survivors, fewer than 6,000 would ever see their homes in Germany again. The cataclysmic defeat at Stalingrad did far more than just destroy one of Germany's finest armies. It shattered the carefully constructed myth of German invincibility. The German army, the Wehrmacht, which had been portrayed by propaganda as a force of unstoppable supermen since 1940, was now exposed as vulnerable, fallible, and ultimately beatable. For the Soviets, the victory was a monumental boost to national morale and confidence, proving they could not only halt the German war machine but crush it. At the same time, Germany's wavering allies, countries like Finland, Hungary, and Romania, who had tied their fates to a German victory, saw the writing on the wall. They began to quietly and desperately search for their own ways to exit the war and make peace with the Allies. The oil from the Caucasus, the entire strategic justification for the campaign, never reached a single German tank. Hitler had gambled everything on a symbolic victory driven by his own pride, and he learned a fatal lesson: you cannot run a tank engine on pride. For a moment, let's step into the realm of counterfactual history and consider what might have been. Imagine if Hitler had suppressed his ego and listened to his generals, allowing the Sixth Army to attempt to break out the moment the Soviet trap first snapped shut in late November. The Soviet winter offensive would still have been a major blow, but 250,000 experienced, battle-hardened German soldiers might have survived to fight in future battles, dramatically altering the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Or, consider an even earlier divergence. What if Army Group South had never been split in two? What if the entire concentrated force had focused exclusively on capturing the Caucasus oilfields instead of being diverted by the symbolic lure of Stalingrad's street signs? Germany might have succeeded in cutting off the fuel supply to the Soviet Red Army and replenishing its own, instead of sacrificing its most powerful army in a frozen urban graveyard. History offers no second chances, but it is vital to recognize how seemingly small decisions, born of personality flaws, can cascade into consequences of an unimaginable scale. The single most decisive factor in this monumental disaster was a leader who fundamentally believed that being stubborn was the same thing as being strong. The Battle of Stalingrad cost Germany and its Axis allies an estimated 800,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. It was a demographic catastrophe. But the hidden cost was arguably even greater. It irrevocably destroyed the myth of German invincibility, a psychological weapon the Third Reich had expertly wielded to intimidate and dominate the continent. Hitler's ego didn't just doom a single army, It fundamentally wrecked Germany's entire grand strategy for winning the war. Every time he blindly refused to authorize a tactical retreat, every time he arrogantly ignored a credible intelligence report, and every delusional order he bellowed from his headquarters was a direct consequence of his unassailable pride. The 330,000 men of the Sixth Army who began the campaign full of confidence found their stories ending in the snow and ice next to the Volga River, all sacrificed at the altar of one man's ego. Thank you for watching. If this video has altered the way you think about the Second World War, please consider sharing it with someone you know who might still believe Stalingrad was just another battle. History remembers Stalingrad not as a fight for a city, but as a timeless and terrifying warning. When leaders begin to confuse their own personal pride with the destiny of their nation, it is always the soldiers on the ground who are forced to pay the final bloody bill.